Now invite the next speaker, Professor Swaran Singh, Chairperson of the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, School of International Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Professor Singh is an expert on Asian affairs, particularly Chinese and Indian foreign and security policy. Professor Singh.
Thank you, Professor Archana Upadhyay. Thank you to the entire team of people who have brought this revival of Eurasian Foundation. I can see that we see this picture of Professor Arun Mohanty on the wall of Dr. Namita Mohanty. I also wish to mention my salutations to the energy and dedication of Professor Arun Mohanty in making SIS so much familiar and aware when Eurasia was becoming important for debates in international relations. So hats off to his energies and great compliments to Namitaji and of course entire team of people who is reviving this foundation and making me part of this panel discussion today. I agree with Ambassador Raghavan. I think it's a bit early as the situation is unfolding and we are making tentative efforts to understand geostrategic implications of what is unfolding in Afghanistan for the larger Eurasian region. And talking of geographies, compared to my friends in Delhi, I'm slightly closer to Eurasia today. I'm speaking from Jalandhar as I talk to you right now. So I would say there is a little more proximity that perhaps I share today if you talk of geographies. And first remark I wish to share with all of you is it's an interesting situation of regime change in reverse. The United States during George Bush Jr. had popularized this idea of regime change that United States would lead, but apparently Taliban has achieved a regime change in reverse. And that is going to, if nothing else, inspire several similar outfits and several similar sentiments in normal mainstream organizations. For example, Tehreek-e-Insaf leaders in Pakistan, you can see, who are otherwise, people who believe in elected governments and democracy, have started making very different rhetoric. So I think it's an interesting case of regime change in reverse. And what then it implies for the region in terms of geostrategic implications. I want to stick my neck out very quickly because we have just 10 minutes, I assume. I think in geostrategic terms, apparently Chinese are going to be the greatest beneficiaries of this regime change in reverse. How it unfolds and to what extent it changes the Eurasia, I will outline that briefly in my coming maybe about 8 minutes that are left with me. Four things that are making it a compulsion-driven policy of Chinese to become the great friends of Taliban, as one after another Taliban leaders love to say now, is one very clearly the old problem of Xinjiang, which had seen in late 1990s violence going up as Taliban came to power in Kabul, Kandahar to be correct. And they want to make sure that they can elicit a certain amount of promise from Taliban that they will not have anything to do absolutely with ETIM, which is East Turkmenistan Independence Movement. How far that promise works on the ground, we will still have enormous doubts about it, but at least we are all noticing that the central leadership of Taliban is trying to talk cosmopolitan, even when cadres on the ground are not listening, and within factions there are always almost fist fighting that you're noticing. Haqqani network and Taliban had recently enormous sort of exercise to do certain kind of correlation to be brought about in terms of even building an interim government. Second, of course, is, as I mentioned, the regime change in reverse means Chinese, and of course people believe Iranians and Russians as well, wanted to push out United States forces and NATO forces out of their backyard. And Chinese are definitely happy to see that it finally worked, and that they have been able to push American forces to the great disadvantage of the newly elected president, Joe Biden. So that again is a compulsion of Americans not to see Americans getting into Eurasia, just as rejuvenation of Eurasia, you have seen, is the new narrative, not just rejuvenation of nation that comes out in Beijing. Beijing, as Ambassador Raghavan just now said, will have to work through Pakistan. So in that sense, if they want to deal with Afghanistan, they will have to work through Pakistan, even if there are disjunctions now between so-called global Taliban now, rather than just a kind of a fighter crowd which was fighting a particular Ashraf Ghani regime. They're now kind of taking power. They have to deal with global community now. So that may bring further disjunctions with Pakistan. But Pakistan and China would like to work together also, that India doesn't have any footprint there. So India's 4+ consulates mission in Kabul was a talk of town in Pakistan, as if aimed at against Pakistan. So the Pakistan, China also wanted India, particularly post Galwan, to push Indian influence also out of it. And final point is the favorite dream project of Xi Jinping, Belt and Road Initiative. Gradually, we had seen China-Pakistan Economic Corridor emerging as the central flagship project of that. And the Iranians, Russians had started showing certain amount of interest. Indeed, some leaders from India's Kashmir also had started saying that we should participate in it. Afghanistan, just like for other projects like TAPI, was a kind of a barrier in the middle. And if Taliban comes on board, and Taliban is already saying repeatedly, we are happy to join Belt and Road Initiative, a expressway from Kabul to Peshawar is already sort of agreed upon. So that is going to benefit China, because they are going to build their network now, because Taliban could potentially come on board, and that will make it easier to bring Russia, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Iran along with it, and create a China-led enormous network of connectivity, which will enhance their commerce. And we all understand post-pandemic Chinese economy of $15.5 trillion. Deep pockets. I mean, they can go on investing just to make sure they have strategic influence in that larger region. So if that happens, two potential things. One, it could lead to development, which is Chinese dominated, led and controlled. And second could be that in case the cadres on the ground continue to see this organizational vulnerability of Taliban, and cadres on the ground begin to disarray and violence erupts within factions, within people on ground, and of course other guests that might arrive in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. We just saw recently ISKP was responsible for the bomb attack of 26th August. You could have Al-Qaeda coming back, or Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed. So these guests could create further chaos on the ground. So radicalization of Eurasia, not just China-led development, economic, material development, which is going to benefit Chinese primarily, but on the ground, maybe other leaders will be happy to see enormous big turnkey projects. But potentially, if the disorder and disconnect continues and orderliness doesn't come inside Taliban-led Afghanistan, radicalization could be another implication. And I think that is something we have to all be very, very careful. Final point in my last 1.5 minutes, what can India do? I think India is already making sure it works at various levels in that sense. You saw recently that Antony Blinken had a video conference from Europe with 22 foreign ministers. Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar was one of them. So India is trying to make sure that the so-called global community, when it is trying to make sure that legitimization of Taliban is bargained, is in that sense being integral part of that network, but at the same time using bilateral connectivity of Iran and Russia. You would remember that the Foreign Minister of India was in Tehran and then in Moscow exactly a few hours, arriving later than the Taliban delegations arriving there. Media has even speculated that some kind of conversations had taken place during those occasions, and indirectly, directly between Foreign Minister and Taliban. Media has been speculating for almost 6 months that India is talking to Taliban. Ambassador Raghavan himself was the first official in non-official capacity, in retired capacity, to go to Moscow conference, right up to the recent meeting of Ambassador Mittal in Doha. So India has been using multi-layered and multi-sectoral kind of engagement, which is so far largely indirect, to make sure that certain amount of contact is maintained. And I think the outcome of Devi Shakti program, and we are able to bring in so many of people of Indian citizenship, people of Indian origin, and citizens of neighboring countries, means that there is some kind of understanding, if not direct conversation with the Taliban, that has happened throughout the period. So India, in that sense, is perhaps showcasing, whether it is advertently, inadvertently, a very calibrated and multi-course, multi-channel, multi-sectoral kind of engagement so far, and making sure that the three things are important on the ground. One, restraint on violence on the ground, rescue of Indian citizens and people of Indian origin, and third, a certain amount of respect for all the institutional arrangements which India had participated in building. And of course, basic human rights, women's rights, and other kind of things are maintained. So basically bargaining with Taliban as to how much they can allow the achievements of last 20 years to sustain. And my last point, India has made investments. We keep sort of talking about it all the time. I don't think that are investment that should worry us at all, because they're not investments which are supposed to bring profits to India. They're investments simply giveaways to people of Afghanistan. And I do not see the new leadership daring, just like you remember Bamiyan Buddha was destroyed by Taliban last time. I don't see any possibility of the new leadership in worst case scenario also destroying India's investments there. So certain amount of goodwill continues. And in case inclusive government becomes a possibility, and certain co-option of earlier leaders like Karzai, directly or indirectly, Abdullah, I don't know what happens to Saleh, but certain amount of inclusiveness would mean that India would have those kind of connections again in the government, where India has dealt with them for last 20 years. So I think it's going to be very, very calibrated and very hour to hour kind of progress that India will have to take note of and see what can be done in Afghanistan. But that's a reality on the ground. And sorry to say, but this is really the last point. It is a terrible thing that Taliban has come to power by brute force. That's a terrible thing to happen. It's a bad example. It will encourage bad people. But they are a reality on the ground. And I want to stick my neck out to say that Taliban is not building the first Islamic emirate on the planet. There are several other Islamic planets who are not very far away from what Taliban is doing. Taliban is only doing it far more crudely, far more badly managed. And India has had good relations with some of those, without naming them, so-called Islamic emirates throughout. And we have managed our relationship very well there. And they could perhaps also be back channel possibilities for India to connect, not only the Western nations. So India today has a much wider net of how it wants to reach and influence Taliban and engage Taliban in that sense in coming times. Let us see how it unfolds. But I think we have a trained diplomat sitting in heading the foreign office today that should bring some advantage. That's it. Thank you very much. Indian leadership is very visible on the global scale. We're much smarter to handle these possibilities. So I am relatively hopeful that at least India's interests would not be suffering even if Taliban comes to power. Thank you, and back to Professor Upadhyay.
Thank you, Professor Swaran Singh, for your brilliant analysis of the unfolding situation in Afghanistan. As we all, rather the world is trying to understand, rather making tentative efforts to the understanding of what you describe as regime change in the reverse. And one of the fallouts could be, as you pointed out, that it may inspire several such organizations to do something similar in our neighborhood. In geostrategic terms, of course, China will be the biggest beneficiary, and it's quite evident, and on several fronts. Of course, one is the BRI project and the kind of material gain that China might gain. And of course, the containment of the East Turkmenistan independence movement is another big gain that China expects. Again, this narrative of pushing the Americans out of the region is something which is being celebrated in several quarters. Of course, there are real threats too. One is clearly radicalization, which cannot be ruled out in the months and the years to come. And though India has very limited footprints right now, as it appears, but yet we have reasons to believe that there are several channels, those informal channels which are already open, and that explains the manner in which India could successfully bring her citizens and others through the, Devi Shakti arrangement. So thank you so much, Professor Swaran Singh.